Yes, we're live. Welcome everybody to the first night of Goodbye Internet, a project by Oddstream, which is an organization for art and technology based in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. Goodbye Internet is a project focusing on the question of what if the internet would cease to exist and the failures of the current internet. We'll be talking about internet ruins and archiving the net tomorrow, live in Nijmegen. And we close Saturday with artist presentations about internet failures and speculative post-internet narratives. Due to a looming lockdown, we're not sure yet if that event is going to be live or online. So please stay updated via our socials. But for now, I'm really happy. I will be talking with author Tim Maughan and artist researcher Ingrid Burrington about the possible end of the internet, science fiction, and the need for narratives about the impact of the internet, power structures, and hidden infrastructures. Could you both first introduce yourselves and add to that an answer of why you think it is important to think about the end of the internet?
Wow. Okay, sorry, my name's Tim. I'm Tim Maughan. I'm the author of Infinite Detail, which is a novel about the end of the internet. I also do some journalism occasionally and do various writing for TV and other places, and I predominantly about the future. That's a super good question, and it's a hard one for me to answer because I wrote a whole book about it, basically, right? Do you know what I mean? And it's like I think we've become so kind of like intrinsically dependent on something that's become infrastructure, that we've made infrastructure that we don't own or control, and there's all these issues around it. I think it's incredibly important that everything from our culture to literally keeping the lights on in our houses, supply chain stuff, all the problems we saw arise during COVID around that stuff is all intrinsically linked to the internet. So I think it's incredibly important that as a civilization we kind of come to terms with what it means and how it works and who controls it and what happens if it goes away. Yeah.
And you, Ingrid.
Okay. I'm sorry. I think like my camera's a little bit smudgy. I'm gonna do this. It's a little tacky, but that's about the same. Whatever. Hi, my name's Ingrid Burrington, and I'm an artist and writer, and I always have trouble with researcher, even though it's true I do research. I guess I just never. It didn't occur to me that other people didn't do or I just was like, that's just reading and talking to people. But apparently, anyway, Tim, can I tell the story of how we met?
Yeah, please do. Oh my God, that story. Yeah, you should. It's a very timely story. So yeah, please.
Yeah, because I think why I'm here. One of the reasons I was invited to be part of this little conversation is also one reason is that I wrote a book about internet infrastructure in New York City. Another, or one of the reasons I jumped at the opportunity was that Tim and I have known each other for quite a long time. And we first met in 2014 at a conference at Princeton University organized by Liam Young, who's now at SciArc, is best known for co-founding the Unknown Fields division, which is the group that does all the wild tours of like container ports and stuff, and lithium fields and stuff like that. And Liam had arranged for this conference on sort of like technology and materiality and all this other kind of vaguely defined stuff to do a bus tour of New Jersey data centers. And so all of these like very oddball people, it's like, I think my friend Rob was like, I feel like I'm on a field trip with my Twitter timeline. Like it was like you and me and James Bridle was there, and like it was just such a weird group of people, and that's how I met Tim and his wonderful partner Sava. And I guess I mentioned that because I get when I think of why it's important to think about or to consider narratives at the end of the internet is it is one way also to understand kind of just the vastness of what the internet is, right? And ending it, I think that Tim's novel is very smart about how it would happen, because it's not like some guerrilla warfare thing where like they take out the data centers and it's like all over. Like in theory that could have some impact, but not a global scale thing. And I think that the scale of kind of interdependence, which I guess is kind of the same thing Tim was saying. It's one way to sort of look at that. I also think it's important to acknowledge, like, the internet probably won't be forever, because I don't know if humans will be forever. Like centuries from now, like aliens could land on this planet, which is, you know, devoid of human life. They're gonna be like, who are these creatures just burying tubes of glass in the earth? What was that for? Like, what's going on? Which I find kind of hopeful. I don't know why.
Yeah, Tim, could you give a short summary about infinite detail? Well, it may be obvious that Goodbye Internet is highly influenced by infinite detail, but could you give a short summary?
Yeah, the book is set like alternating chapters between two time periods. One is called Before and one's called After, and the Before is kind of like a slightly accelerated version of now, just very slightly accelerated. Like maybe it's not even the future, it's like now, but we went slightly different routes with certain kinds of technology. So augmented reality is quite a big deal in this timeline. And the other time period the book's set in is called After, and it's set 10 years after the internet has stopped working for whatever reason. And it's about people coming to terms with both of that, but both coming to terms with the reality, our digital reality now, and what that means, and then 10 years later coming to terms with living with all that having disappeared. And really the question it asks, it's a question, I'm not really interested in writing fiction that answers questions. I just like writing fiction that asks them, which is I know it's a really cliche thing to say, and it's a really cop-out kind of answer, but it's true. I think, I think it's the most honest thing I can do. I write books and short stories about things that I'm trying to work out rather than things I know the answer to. And it kind of asks two questions, really. One is like, what would happen if the internet if the internet was destroyed, right? And the other question is, why would we want to do that? Is there a reason why we would want to do that? And when I started writing it, which was like 2012, so it took me a long time to write this book. It wasn't published until 2019. I kind of, that second question, why would we want to do it, seemed a little more out there. And then the next sort of 5 years kind of gave us all the answers to that, I think. I think, everything from social media to the economy was so weirdly impacted over those periods. So obviously democracy as well, and presidential elections and Brexit and all sorts of things. It suddenly became like an easier sell, I felt, to kind of, explain why we might want to shut the internet down, or why some people might want to. See, that's kind of the book, really. It's kind of about before and after this collapse of the internet, and why these things would happen, and what they kind of mean, and what the impact is for them. Like the original idea I had for it, actually, if I'm honest, I started writing in like sort of 2011, 2012, and it was around about that time. It's around about that time WikiLeaks had appeared, who aren't even a wiki, as Ingrid will, rightly point out to you, and the Snowden revelations were, when was that? It was around like 2012, 2013, something like that. Around about that time, there was a lot of I remember waking up in the morning, and sometimes parts of the internet wouldn't be working. Like Amazon would be down, or PayPal would be down, or parts of Google were down, or eBay was down for some reason. You're like, what's going on? And there was this, this kind of battle between anonymous and large tech companies going on, which kind of fizzled out, but it felt at the time like it might be something bigger, and it kind of made me feel that like maybe these structures aren't permanent, or they're not as permanent or as strong, or they're more fragile, rather, maybe is a better way of putting it, than we kind of accepted, we kind of considered. Also around that time, and I have to give him full credit. I have to give him full credit for a lot of things. Bruce Sterling wrote his end of year, kind of keynote thing, or whatever he calls it. And he talked to Nair around about, I can't remember what year this was, but it was when I was starting off again and with the book, and he wrote about how, why are we assuming the internet's permanent? Why are we assuming there isn't a period of post-internet? Why are we assuming that it either doesn't transform completely or goes away? And that was suddenly interesting to me, because I had been trying to write fiction about the internet for a long time, or stuff that's related to the internet, about culture especially. And I was like, well, I'm making an assumption this is always going to be like this. It's always going to be here. That suddenly became really interesting to me.
Is that also the reason why it's a near future science fiction book, and not like Ingrid said, about a narrative of the aliens and like a more far away?
Yeah, very much so. I set myself when I started writing science fiction about 10, 12 years ago now. I've been wanting to do it all my life, really, or literally all my life. Like since I was young enough to read it, I'd kind of wanted to do it, and I'd been putting it off and put it off and put it off and put it off until I was in my late 30s, early 40s before I started taking it seriously. And I'd always wanted to. I set myself this ridiculous challenge in a weird way. I realised with hindsight how ridiculous it was of writing this very near future fiction. I write stuff that's set in the next 5 years. I'm always thinking about what's going to happen next 5 to 10 years from where we are now. It's a stupid thing to do with hindsight. It really is. But I kind of really enjoy it. And I kind of, I think it's a really useful thing to do. The first thing people say when you do it, especially science fiction-y people, they're kind of like, aren't you worried that your works could be dated? And I kind of want my work to be dated. I want us to kind of reassess and re-own that phrase dated as something positive and not negative. If you can pick up a piece of science fiction, whether it's written last week or whether it's written 100 years ago, at what you're reading is about the present that it was written. You're reading about the time in which it was written. And if that's obvious, then that's good. It's worked, right? Because it's captured the fears and the aspirations and the concerns or whatever, the culture of the time. It doesn't matter if you didn't get the future right. That's not important. It's grasping those concerns and getting them right, which is interesting to me anyway as a reader. So I kind of quite like the idea of really pushing that as far as possible, and not having to use metaphors and allegory to look at issues that I'm worried about now, but actually writing about those issues now through the genre of science fiction. I think you can really do that. Like, whether it's COVID, I've just come off a COVID fiction project, or like whether it's police brutality or something. It's fascinating, it's interesting, it's understandable why people might write science fiction set 100 years in the future which uses metaphor, or even fantasy set in some fancy Middle Ages setting to talk about an issue around power and control and police brutality. But I'm kind of like, these things are science fictional enough that you can just write science fiction about them now. Like, and that's kind of, it's a stupid thing to do, like I say, because it becomes really hard. But I find it kind of exhilarating to do it, and reading other people do it is always interested and excited me. So,
well, I saved a tweet of yours in March 2020, which was "Be right back, writing a science fiction novel in real time." So, which made me laugh because last 2 years I was constantly thinking, infinite detail, and hashtag infinite detail was also a really interesting hashtag on Twitter sometimes with the pandemic, but also with the Myanmar and Hong Kong protests. And so that's why I also asked you that question, why we writing near future science fiction, because you grasp the societal developments really well, I think, in the book.
I hope so. I hope I grasp things. It's kind of like I'm in a weird place as well, because there's that golden rule about whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction about the future, that you can't predict the future. And obviously that's true. But I also push back at that slightly. I don't think you can predict the future, but you can work out what capitalism is going to do, right? Do you know what I mean? Because capitalism is always going to do the same thing, which is exploiting everybody and it can, and any resources it can in order to turn a profit, right? And it's a really depressing framework once you start looking at trend emergence, any technology, or any political trend or any cultural thing through those lenses. It suddenly becomes reasonably easy to not to predict exactly what's going to happen, but kind of and like people have been doing this for literally 100 years. People have been doing this, and they've been doing it pretty well. I mean, like, you know, obviously Cyberpunk's the obvious kind of example. Everybody's like, we live in a cyberpunk dystopia now, ha ha ha. And it's like, it's not that funny because we do. And we knew this. If you were my age and you were 14 when Neuromancer came out or whatever, or I wasn't quite that old, but you know, that age, and you read it, and then you read the other books. I mentioned Sterling, but you know, Pat Cadigan and all sorts of people, Jack Womack's early books. You read those books when they came out, and you're like, it's depressing to live through now because you feel like we had some warning about this. You know, everyone laughs at Gibson for not predicting the cell phone. Yeah, okay, but he predicted pretty much everything else, right? Do you know what I mean? He predicted you know, so much about network culture that's come true now. So yeah, it's a stupid thing to do, but I kind of like doing it. Mm-hmm. So there you go. That's my career summed up in a sentence.
Ingrid, does science fiction influence your work, or?
I think I mean, I love science fiction, and I've done sort of projects that are sort of science fiction adjacent. I like co-wrote a novella with my friend Brendan Byrne that was sort of a experiment in sort of like playing out this idea that I had related to sort of like, could you like kind of hold like tech companies like accountable for like horrible things they did, actually, like it, and then like kind of from that, like what happens if you hold like an entire country accountable, like thinking about sort of like truth and reconciliation commissions, and like how that could, like, that would never happen in America, but like what would it look like if it did? And it's like, it looked like neoliberal garbage, spoiler, but
spoiler alert.
Yeah, so I've tried my hand at writing science fiction. I think Brendan's really the sci-fi writer. I was like way more into the world building side. I just was like, I would just be like wait, why are we doing that?
Which is an important part of science fiction, of course.
Yeah, just a lot of like thinking about the world and what would make sense and what wouldn't. And I think that, I mean, one thing, like, Tim, that you didn't say about infinite detail that I think about, or what I think the book is about, is like, it's also like, it's about like the end of the internet, but it's also like about falling in love and like grief.
Definitely.
I cried reading this book, man. and I think that the thing science fiction can do when it's done really well is like not, and when it's also about like, you know, telling a story that stirs, you know, people's emotions, and like it gets to like things about just being a person, is like, I think you actually said this to me once, Tim, something about just like it is not true, but it gets at bigger truths, right? That's sort of what fiction can do. And I think that with science fiction, I think that I mean the genre I find myself increasingly drawn to is like alternate history sort of sci-fi, like sort of just like, what if things forked this way? And I always find that really compelling because I think it's important to understand that the world we live in is deeply contingent, right? Like everything that's sort of just taken for granted could have been otherwise. There is not really a sense of inevitability to things. And that's the thing that I find like powerful in fiction and science fiction in particular.
Mm-hmm. And I was also wondering, this year I led 2 workshops for students who had to think of a future scenario of a world without the internet. and their futures were really optimistic and green. People were, well, after the first shock of having to live without the internet, were really more peaceful and more in tune with nature and each other. And your view of an internetless future is way more bleak. There's a kind of uber localism because the global economy collapsed. There's poverty, hunger, big social differences. But also the before part was also of the book, before the internet crashed, was also in a way really bleak. And I was thinking, well, people need stories to be able to reflect on certain topics. But I was wondering, Tim, in what way do you feel a kind of responsibility in telling stories and how they are told? Because yours, well, Infinite Detail borders on dystopia, or is dystopia. I don't know if we can say that, but the student scenarios, and I don't necessarily think those scenarios are bad, but they're really hopeful. So their idea of a world without the internet is really hopeful and utopian. And I know. First, I want to ask about the responsibility you may or may not feel.
That's a question. Responsibility. Oh my God, should I be feeling some responsibility? I kind of like, it's this weird thing, like I get asked occasionally, do you consider yourself an activist? And I'm like, no. I'm immediately suspicious of an artist that calls himself an activist. I mean, you can be both. I mean, you can be an activist and be an artist separately. But if you're going around saying my art is my activism, I'm slightly skeptical a lot of the time, because what activism really is this huge kind of, like, there's an Astra Taylor essay that really influenced the end of Infinite Detail, actually really helped me get the final kind of act of it together and realize what I was trying to say, where she talks about the difference between activism and organizing and what those things really mean, and actually affecting real political change via, organizing or activism is something that you don't do, at home on the internet necessarily. It's something you have to get together and organize with people, and it's something that doesn't happen instantly. It's something that, like, people literally dedicate their whole lives to. I think from like looking at the civil rights movement in the US in the 60s, people were doing that their whole lives. They died doing that, and people started doing that in their teens, and they did it until the day they died. And that's the kind of organizing we need. I don't think so. I wouldn't ever class myself as one of those people, because I've never done that, and I wouldn't be very good at it, and I don't have the skill set for doing that kind of organizing people. So I wouldn't. So I don't think that's a responsibility I need to take on, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? I don't think it's like a. I'm not there to give you a nice answer. I'm not there to. I see a lot of this, and it makes me laugh. I saw a lot of discussion, since Trump got in, but it's a thing that comes up almost daily on Twitter. Someone saying, "No, okay, so it's no time for dystopias now. We don't need dystopias now. We need stories about positive futures. We need stories about solutions. No more dystopias." And my initial reaction, fairly or unfairly, every time is, so you're going to stop listening to the people who are getting it right now. Now you're going to stop listening to the people who've been getting it right for the last 50 years, right? Because a lot of the dystopias, it's a really, really misused term. And I don't like the term particularly, but then it's also useful as a shorthand. It's such a huge topic just talking about that. Like when the book came out and the publisher was promoting it and they're giving net galleys away and people on Goodreads were reading it, the people didn't enjoy it. People came to it thinking it was a dystopia and didn't enjoy it because it wasn't the dystopia that they were looking for. It was a dystopia they couldn't relate to, that a lot of people said, which meant it didn't have a hero at the center of it who had something special about them that meant that they could change things. And even though I do play with that theme in the book quite consciously right from the very first page, kind of play with that theme. That's something that's interested me, the idea of heroes that can fix things. But yeah, it's not, I'm not here to, there's some writers who are wonderful at giving you good visions of the future. I'm just, at the moment, rewatching Star Trek TNG And that's a whole other story. Me getting into Star Trek, it's only something that's happened the last few years. I grew up really not liking Star Trek, but I really appreciate TNG for the world it's trying to portray. And then that people do that sort of stuff, it's interesting and it's important, but it's not me. I don't do that. I do a different kind of thing, or at least I do it at the moment. So no, I don't feel any responsibility to that. It's interesting your students talking about the like positive stuff, and it's good to see, and it's exciting, and it's to me, it means that they're thinking about one part of the problem really well, and they're thinking about one part of the problem really clearly, and they understand the problems, the internet, social media, and big tech, and all these things, the threats they pose, not just to culture, but to the environment increasingly, which is something, Ingrid knows more about than I do. But then there's the other part of it, which is that, the book came out and had really good reviews, but you'd read the comments of the reviews and people would be saying things like, nonsense, the internet collapses, we'll just go back to using paper like we did during the British Empire. Literally saw somebody say that. And it's like, okay, dude, that's your project then. When the shipping algorithms collapse, we'll get you a pen and paper and an abacus, and you can sort everything out. Like I've heard,
Even the British Empire had the fucking telegraph, man.
Right, exactly. People don't understand that these things have disappeared. They don't only just don't work. They're kind of gone. We don't live like that anymore. We don't have a backup plan for any of this stuff. It's kind of the issue with the book and this whole topic. So we don't really have backup plans. We might back up our data, but it's, if data disappears, right? That's not the or access to data disappears. We don't have a backup plan. I've talked to. After writing the book, and I talked to people who worked at large shipping companies who lived through the WannaCry ransomware attack, and their stories are terrifying. Their world collapsed in front of them for a handful of days. They were putting guys in cars and driving them to ports with a clipboard to try and work out what was on container ships. It's not something you could do. They tried doing it. It wasn't something they could do. And for a few days there, it looked genuinely terrifying. And it's not something, so that's the other part of the book. The cultural side of it's really important. But there's this idea that, if it disappears, so much of our infrastructure disappears. And cultural infrastructure as well, don't get me on a rant about Spotify or something like that. And which also the book's about, right, in some ways with the chapters about music and stuff. It's, it's about that disappears instantly. And we don't own that, this culture we generate, whether it's on YouTube or TikTok or on Spotify or even on Bandcamp or somewhere, we have these platforms that we generate culture on, that culture is distributed on. We don't own or control them, and that's not. You can make the argument it's always been like that. It's been like that since the dawn of broadcast radio and broadcast television and the movie industry and the record industry. But it's a different level of it now. And that's instantaneous between us creating a project, hitting post, and it becoming corporate data on a server somewhere. And we don't own any of the infrastructure as soon as it leaves our computer or our phone or whatever. We don't own that infrastructure. You arguably don't own the infrastructure within our phones a lot of the time. It's something that people like Cory Doctorow will argue quite rightly. So yeah, I think it's. I mean, that's the whole book. It's ambiguous, and it's kind of like the whole thing's meant to be a double-edged sword, really. Yeah. But I'm glad the kids are thinking about it. I'm glad that you did this project and people are at least thinking about it.
Well, I did ask to not make it truly dystopian, but I was also surprised they didn't even make a dystopia out of it. It was completely the opposite. So
that is fascinating. That is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's that thing with dystopia as well. There's that cliche: one person's dystopia is one person's utopia. I mean, a more useful thing is. There's a lot of stuff, especially in the West or the global North, that we consider dystopian. We consider dystopian when it happens to us, right? But it's already happening to somebody else somewhere, and that's the reality of how most of our manufacturing is done for a start, right? That's the reality of how supply chains work and things like this. It's the reality of censorship. It's reality of all kinds of ways that we interact with the internet. In some ways, that things that feel dystopian to us, not having access to something, might feel dystopian, but people live like that now. So yeah, it's a tough. Anyway, whenever you start talking about defining dystopias or what they mean, or if they're useful or responsible, it's a tough conversation a lot of the time.
There's like a very simple also like narrative reason that a lot of science fiction seems dystopian, and it's that nothing happens in a utopia. I mean, like as David Byrne once told us, heaven is a place where nothing ever happens, right? And I think that like very insightful science fiction writers like have been able to kind of like walk that knife's edge, right? Like, I mean, The Dispossessed is probably, you know, the most like tremendous example, and Le Guin called it an ambiguous utopia because like there were things that sucked about living on Anaris. Like most of that book is about a famine, and yet like I would rather that live in that world than anything else kind of presented in the novel. And like there's a moment towards the end of the book where a character says from Earth says to Shevek that like, you know, from my perspective, the like capitalist planet or us that you were saying is like so bad and unequal. It's like it's a fucking paradise compared to where I'm from, and which I also just was like that was a gut punch. But yeah, I think the idea that like any, especially like when utopias or kind of science fictions are like tied into, you know, what if the world worked this way instead of that? The idea that like it's all gonna work out is, first of all, narratively boring. Like, what are you gonna write up? Like, there's no conflict. Like, what's this book? It's just poems, I guess. Which, like, you know, if you want to write poems, cool. But also, it's like that's not like humans are still gonna be selfish and hurt and sad and scared. Like people will still have conflict in a different kind of like system. Like you will still have your heart broken in a world without capitalism, but like maybe like you don't have to have that and also be stressed out about like your loan debt. That's
but that's what because I'm watching Star Trek Next Generation again also. But that's also, well, it's kind of presented as a utopia, but there's still conflict, there's heartbreak, there's other worlds they're trying.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So
and this is the thing as well about any dystopia, that like even if they don't succeed at the end, and even if they're not like some kind of magical hero, there's always characters or there's always people in the books, in those stories that are fighting back, and that's to me is hopeful. To me, any dystopia is hopeful if it's done well, because it's presenting something as being wrong, right? And hope starts when you call out when things are wrong, right? When you point out this is bad and it needs to change. We need to stop this from happening. What if this happened? Because it might happen. Any of these things are hopeful. Just doing that, right? Just pointing it out, pointing a finger at it, presenting it, to me is a hopeful act, right? Because you're hoping that someone will do something about it, right? Or that we'll all come together and do something about it. There's certainly that in the book. When I wrote it, it was, you know, I started writing it and then a bunch of stuff happened to me, and you know, I fell in love, right? It was one of the big things. I had a long distance relationship, like one of the characters in the books. I ended up in the book. I moved to New York, so New York ended up in the book. I traveled up supply chain on container ships. That ended up in the book. So these stuff were all things that I was concerned about or excited about, but I wanted to, you know, just the dystopian stuff, the infrastructure stuff, the cultural stuff collapsing, was stuff that worried me, that I wanted to. I felt hopeful to be telling other people about it, if that makes sense. I think that's really the thing that keeps me going. People are like, how your work can be quite bleak. How do you survive with that? And I'm like, well, it's getting it off my chest, man, in some ways. And in other ways, it's like, you know, if I point this out, at least I've done some tiny little bit to making someone aware of it. You know, if one person reads the book or short story and goes, oh, this is bad, we need to think about this or do something about this. I feel like I've achieved some little thing just for doing that. Yeah, it's the whole conversation around dystopias, like I say, is always weird. But yeah, they're fundamentally hopeful to me, I think.
Well, related maybe to this, or maybe to that question, aren't you afraid big tech is going to run off with your novel like they do with other science fiction novels these days?
Yeah, the whole metaverse thing's been a lot. As someone that read Snow Crash when it came out, so.
Yeah, sorry, I had to ask.
Yeah, we were talking
Yeah.
before the stream started about how
Yeah.
everybody's got a hot take on this. In the last 2 months, everyone's had a hot take on the metaverse and supply chains, and the two things that I just think I spend most of my day thinking about. It feels like I spent most of 10 years thinking about that. And it's funny because I wrote a book like 10 years ago, came out 10 years ago this year. It's like just a collection of 3 short stories, Paintwork, which are about the metaverse. And I didn't call it the metaverse because I was like, that would be lazy if I called it the metaverse, because everybody would just go, "You're just stolen that from Neil Stephenson." But so it's weird, yeah. How science fiction is used like that is strange and weird. And there's definitely a trend, not even a trend. There's definitely a kind of modus operandi in Silicon Valley of looking at these books just for product ideas. And I know because I've been approached about it myself. And when that first book came out, Paintwork, like Nokia was still a big thing. And I remember someone from their AR lab following me on Twitter, and I kind of like cheekily said to them, "Oh, you should read my book," and they were like, "Yeah, we read it," like this. I was like, "Oh, okay," right, and that's kind of a weird thing that's happened to me a few times. It's really upsetting to see science fiction just be reduced to kind of like a catalogue of speculative ideas for startups, and stripped of other kind of context. It's. But I don't know how you combat it. Sorry, Ingrid.
Oh, I think that like, I don't know if it's like a problem of just like poor reading comprehension. Like it's like is the other stuff not coming through? Like it's
those apps that Instagram always trying to sell me, those apps that CEOs use to speed read. I'm blaming those for largely for it. Do you know, Blinkist or whatever it's called or something like that.
Yeah, because like there's some things. I mean, I feel like with William Gibson and like cyberpunk stuff, like that was a dystopia, but like it did look cool as hell, or like read as looking cool as hell, and there's a lure to that, right? I did not read Snow Crash when it first came out. I read Snow Crash a couple of years ago. So I was just like, what the hell is this? Like, this sounds terrible. And I don't think this writer has met a woman in his life.
Well,
but that's my problem. But I feel like, yeah, if I'd read that when I was 12 years old, I would have been like, this is cool as fuck. Right. And so maybe also some of it's kind of like the point at which these books become like part of tech bros' like lives and kind of literatures, right? Because like, yeah, you kind of skip over the dystopia parts when you're a kid. Like it's in the same way that like, I don't know, I read like, what was it? I read a lot of Stephen King when I was a kid.
Same.
And like a lot of like giant depressing novels, but like I didn't really understand how fucked up they were until like I was much older and was like, why did they let me do that, right? So maybe some of it's also just kind of like there's sort of like gaps.
I think that's a huge. I think you're spot on. I think you're absolutely spot on. I mean, like the person I read quite a bit of when I was way too young was Ballard. J Ballard's just like the biggest influence on me, after probably alongside Gibson, the two of them probably, But I read Ballard when I was a kid because my dad had his books, and the short stories were in science fiction anthologies. My dad had all these science fiction anthologies from the 60s and 70s and earlier, but they had books going back to, they had stories in them going back to the 40s, and you'd be reading, I'd pull one off the shelf and read these short stories. There'd be an Asimov short story, and you go, okay. And there'd be like a Arthur C. Clarke short story, you go, okay, that's interesting. And you turn the page, be a Philip K. Dick short story, and I was like 11, and I'd be like, what the fuck's this? And then you carry on, and there's, like a Bradbury short story, and you're like, oh, Bradbury again, and then turn the page, and there's a J.G. Ballard short story's made its way in there somehow, and it's like The Dead Astronaut or something, and you're like, whoa, it's just mind-blowing. But you don't understand the context of them. I think you're right. I think your Snow Crash comment is like spot on, really. I think if you read it when you were like 12 or 13, it probably was super exciting. I read it not long after it came out. I was sort of 18, 19, and I think see what he was trying to do, which I think was a satire of cyberpunk largely. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, he's not very good with women and other things. But that kind of weird over the top machoism that's in the book, I think it's part I hope is part of him kind of taking Cyberpunk to task, or what Cyberpunk came anyway. It, after Gibson and Sterling and other people had kind of moved on to other things, it became this kind of what it is now, right? This kind of Cyberpunk means you've got a cool robot arm and a gun and whatever, and you got weird green
in VR.
Exactly, you get fired in VR, and you've got a weird light behind you. It keeps changing between green and magenta. That's Cyberpunk, and like I think I hope the book was kind of being more satirical than that. But yeah, you're right. I think when you come to these books, and I think you're right, probably because I think most tech bro CEOs that are reading these books in a hurry are reading them as though they're in a 12-year-old. Do you know what I mean? They're not reading them with the brain of a responsible thinking man or woman.
Well, but I think like if at least in the case of Snow Crash, like if that's like your entry into Cyberpunk, you have no idea that it's satire. Right.
Yeah, exactly. No, precisely.
And like I didn't feel like I was reading it like I think this is satire, but like I didn't really grasp that like Cyberpunk was a big enough thing to even be satirizing at that point.
Yeah,
like this feels like a very like this is some like really niche internecine like sci-fi infighting. But then I feel like you were the one who reminded me, like, it's like, no. Cyberpunk was like William Gibson was on the cover of magazines. Like, oh
no, Gibson was in the Enemy every week when I was reading it as a kid. Do you know what I mean? Like, at least mentioned Bono was talking about him in interviews. Do you know what I mean? And stuff like that. And like Cyberpunk was kind of everywhere. Hollywood didn't know what to do with it, which is the only reason it kind of didn't explode into the Matrix, really. But before that, yes. Like, it was considered serious fiction. Science fiction was considered serious literature again for like 10 years as a result of it, and it was an exciting time to be in the scene. It was kind of a lot was happening. It felt important, and I didn't write any at the time because I was taking lots of drugs and going to raves instead. But I did finally get around to it 30 years later.
I wanted to leave the topic of science fiction for now and
please
talk about complexity and supply chain and how our world is getting more complex. Tim, you wrote a couple of articles about that, and Ingrid, I've known your work for a while, and you're also trying to uncover hidden infrastructures. And also in relation to the book, before the crash, people were opposing all those big technological developments by making an independent network in the neighborhood of Stokes Croft in Bristol. But at the same time, they were kind of gentrifying a working class neighborhood. And they're taking along with them groups of people who didn't ask for that alternative network to be built in their neighborhood. And so it's also, your book is also about privilege. And that is easy to, I dare not say the word, but it's easy to have utopian dreams. But yeah, they are the lucky privileged few. And relating to complexity also, I think it's still an important question how we can protest or oppose to these big technological developments, especially or even though we can't completely grasp them. So it's a question for you both also, because both of you are really trying to make sense maybe of that complexity of those systems. But how can you take action, maybe not as an activist, but take action against these developments?
I've got this really timely point I should point out that like the idea for one of the ideas for the People's Republic of Stokes Croft in the book, which is this, like you say, this neighborhood of Bristol, which has cut itself off from the internet and then replaced that with a kind of like mesh network, kind of decentralized network. I got that idea from Ingrid, like originally, because Ingrid did an art project it was on Governor's Island, right, Ingrid?
Yeah,
When you were at IBEAM.
I curated an exhibition for IBEAM, which is an art and technology organization in New York City, and they had use of this house on Governor's Island, which is like a former Coast Guard base that's now sort of just got all these like abandoned buildings. It's quite cool. But yeah, they could like put up shows in this house, but it didn't have any internet, which I thought was the funniest thing, because you're like an art and technology organization and all of it's like offline. And I was like, oh man, it would be really funny to do like a show of like local area network based art. And I said that, and that meant they were like, great, so you're gonna do it. It was called Little Nets, and it was only like 3 projects, but yeah, the point was kind of to like, you had to go to this island, like right off of New York City, like take a little ferry and go for a little walk to log on to see web pages. That was kind of the whole joke. It was the whole, like, that was the bit. But it was like, it was nice because it was like, it made that sort of like, you know, things that were added to like, I think there was like an Etherpad system in there so people could like, I think we had a couple of events. And so it's like documentation of that just like existed only on these little servers on this little network in this one place. Yeah. And I think I learned about mesh networks from living in New York through Hurricane Sandy, right? Because in Red Hook, there had been this project pre-Sandy developing a local mesh network with a Red Hook community center called the Red Hook Initiative. And they were able to use that to kind of like set up just sort of like a local internet for like kind of bulletin board type stuff, and then connect that to like a satellite backhaul that FEMA brought in, because most people's internet was out because everything was out because it was a bad hurricane. And since then, a lot of the people who were involved in that project, developing that mesh network, have gone on to work in other parts of New York City. There's some amazing work happening in the South Bronx at a place called The Point. I love shouting them out because they're just so great. Yeah, sorry, that was a lot, but mesh networks, yeah. You had a point, and I think I probably completely derailed it.
Yeah, what was the question?
Sorry. I think the question, I think you were about this. I think you were saying something about how you got the idea for mesh networks, and then I just wouldn't stop talking.
Oh, so there was you asked about complexity, didn't you?
Also, and how you can oppose to big developments while it's so complex.
Yeah, it's one of those things I don't pretend to know like the answers to, and it's really tricky. And like, how do you just remove yourself from these networks of harm, or do you try and use them for other things? Is just this eternal question that I think anybody involved in kind of thinking critically, let alone political kind of activism in the current era, it's just this dumbfounding question, especially as we've seen how wrong it can go and how badly misinformation's been moved around. And the complexity thing is, by its definition, it's like, it's interesting what you're saying. I think Ingrid's work probably touches this more than mine in some ways. Ingrid's very good at like highlighting and mapping these kind of networks and exposing them. I'm more interested in kind of pointing at them and going, like, do you know what I mean? That's kind of like, you know what I did? That's kind of like pointing at them and go, Christ, we don't know how this works, do we? And we pretend we do, but we really don't. It's like, for example, you know, like, when the book came out, a couple of people said to me, you don't really talk about climate change much in the book. And I don't, like, on purpose, deliberately decided. It's mentioned, it's there. There's even a pandemic mentioned briefly in the background in a couple of lines and stuff. But I kind of deliberately didn't want to sort of hold the book down with more information on trying to tackle that. But now, you know, Ingrid knows far more about this than me. But now I'm starting to think about, well, what if climate change takes down the internet? Like, well, data centers flood. What if you know, storms bring down like microwave transmitters and things like that, how quickly can we get that shit back up and running again? Can we get that back up and running again if it happens on a big enough scale that data starts getting lost?
That was a question. That was one of my questions related to the future of the internet and climate crisis, especially, for those exact reasons you mentioned. And I was thinking, I'm really wondering what you have to say about this, Ingrid.
Yeah, I mean, I think people in the data center industry are thinking about this far more intensely than I am, in that they're the ones who are having to think about like where they site their data centers and things like that. And I think, I mean, I don't know. It's not that like I don't care if like a data center goes down, but there is something kind of unnerving to me. Like, I think of the image after Hurricane Sandy in New York City, where Lower Manhattan was completely dark except for the Goldman Sachs offices, right? Because they had like backup generators and they had all their like stuff. And like, I remember I think when Hurricane Irma, maybe, it went through Florida, I want to say in 2017, we were reading about some other data center. It was like how we like stayed online through this hurricane. It's like, good. But like also this is bad for a lot of people. It's sort of like the fact that like we can keep like Facebook running smoothly, like Capital can continue to kind of operate, but like regular people can't like, find out if their kids are okay. I do remember actually also like earlier this year when there was that huge like kind of cold front thing in Texas, a lot of like kind of like unexpected outages happened as a result of that. So I'm very like, I'm really curious how people are feeling about Texas as a data center site, because they have put a lot of effort into making it like luring big companies to build data centers there. And it's like, yeah, their power grid kind of sucks though. Like, who think
I'm in Canada and we've had freezing rain for the first time this morning. And that's a thing that scares you as a Canadian, because the snow's fine. The freezing rain comes and it settles on trees, and then the trees fall over and they bring power lines and cable lines and everything else down, right? And it's a very real and weird thing. No, Ingrid, but what you were saying about the data centers during Sandy, this is from that tour we went on when we first met. We stood there. We did this. We saw 3 data centers of different scales and purpose. And the first one we saw was Princeton's own data center, which is everything from email to particle physics experiments is run through servers on there. Then we went to a very, very corporate data center built out shipping containers.
Their whole thing was that they put the servers in shipping containers.
Shipping containers, yeah. That was Iron Mountain, or the company that became Iron Mountain.
I feel like that was like they were doing containerization before it was like a cool software thing.
Yeah, exactly. And then the third place we went was a place that mainly did porn, and that was hilarious because it was like what you'd imagine a porn data center might look like, and that it had like box fans outside server cabinets and cables running everywhere, and it was kind of great, and the guy was kind of weird, and it felt like it was all going to collapse on its own at some point anyway. But my point was we walked into the Princeton run and the guy gave us a tour, and he very proudly stood up in front of us all and he said, during Sandy 50,000 homes in this area didn't have power, but we still did. And I just remember looking at him going, great, I'm glad everybody that works at Princeton could get their work emails. There was 50,000 people who didn't have, like, were freezing to death and didn't have electricity, right? Do you know what I mean? And I'll actually put it, there's a little hint, there's a mention of it right towards the end of the book about storms coming and people piling into data centers because they've heard there's still power there, right? And it's that, like Ingrid says, it's just this really jarring. Like, we can keep capital running, we can keep corporate data running, but we can't necessarily keep electricity on for people that need it. Is deeply problematic. It's deeply concerning.
Yeah, this is kind of. Can I jump on a thing? Sorry. Because I earlier this year I wrote a short essay about not repudiating infrastructure, but kind of wanting to think more precisely about what it is to like use the word infrastructure to describe so many like. in fact, anything can be like infra to something that is like supra if you like spend enough time looking at it. And so I think, and I don't know, in my experience, infrastructure kind of has a certain, like, it's understood as powerful, but like it's more often assumed like good faith than it really should be, right? At least in the United States, I feel like there's sort of a like, I mean, like the way that, you know, it's like everyone could agree on infrastructure except Christian cinema. But sorry, that was like a very niche America joke. I'm sorry.
It's an important one.
She's a bad woman in the Senate. But I think like, and also there's a sense of like, it's like the people's, right? Like infrastructure being something that is like towards a common good, right? And I started sort of experimenting with switching out infrastructure for the means of production when talking about things like data centers or submarine cables and things like that. And I think it's like, yeah, the reason that like a data center can still have power while 50,000 people don't have power is because a data center is like a piece of the means of production, right? Like it is capital, and like it will be maximized and it will be made resilient because there's a priority for that, right? And I think, and it's not to like slag on using like describe, like, because I think you can still use the word infrastructure. I'm not like, stop, I'm done with this word. It's more of a like, I think that when talking about sort of like, how do we like make, you know, just infrastructures for the internet? It's like, well, it's all private property. So maybe start there. Maybe start with like distribution of ownership and like, and I'm not saying like that would fix things, you know, that again, that's like a, you know, different sets of problems. But I do think there is a sense of like the abstraction of all of this stuff into infrastructure rather than the means of production, and is a way of kind of, it's like hiding the bigger problem. I do want to get like, I guess back, respond sort of to your earlier question, just sort of about like what is to be done, because I think it's a thing I struggle with a lot because I don't actually, I'm not a big fan of the like one thing you can do right now sort of like approach to trying to get people interested in like, you know, complex issues, partly because it's sort of like, it makes the problem about like your consumer guilt or something, as opposed to like actually having empathy for people. But I think, yeah, I think like I've been rereading Max Liboiron's Pollution is Colonialism, which is a really lovely book in general. But I think one of the things that they talk about is sort of the scale mismatch of like, well, I'm just not going to use plastics, and that's how I'm doing my part. And it's like, plastics are going to keep being made. Like the industry just is going to keep pumping them out, and like a lot of the plastic pollution that's of concern isn't consumer plastic. It's going to be like used in industrial settings. And I think their larger point, I think, about sort of what is to be done has more to do with reframing like, and thinking about like your own intentions in how you live in the and do stuff in the world, right? Like sort of who are you beholden to? Where are your obligations? What kind of world are you trying to participate in? And what do you feel entitled to that like maybe you shouldn't, right? Like colonialism is largely like believing that you have a right to like land and life, that like you have that with like no kind of justification. There is no justification. Like, no one can belong to anyone. But I think that some of it's, I think like telling anyone what to do. I feel I can't tell anyone what to do, but like thinking about how they want to do things, I find kind of, or I think that's a thing that I'm hoping to like push more with people, because it's it just feels more relevant.
Yeah, I think also that was kind of why I asked because it's so complex, and where to start, and not like you can do anything. I really like the calling an infrastructure a means of calling it a means of production instead of an infrastructure, because it gives you a different perspective and makes you think in a different way about it. So I think maybe was also part of my question. Yeah. So I don't think, it is possible to do one or the 10 things you should do too.
Yeah.
But,
I think sometimes the question of sort of like, what can I do, is sort of about like immediate harm reduction, or trying to figure out how you can like kind of like play a role in like stopping the bleeding. And like, in some ways, like the thing that actually maybe needs to happen is like question the entire premise, right? Like I think about, I was thinking about this, Sam, when you're talking about just sort of like how like, I'm not an organizer, and like, you know, books, they do their part, but it's not like a big deal. I was thinking about how I think about David Graeber every single day, which is like a me problem, but like, I think about what like Max Neely Cohen, a mutual friend of ours, once said in a talk that books are time weapons, because the like kind of impact they're going to have, like it's going to kind of be like distributed over time. And I feel like I think about what that book did, what that book has done. And obviously it's not the book, it's the people who read the book, and the things they did because of like the way the book changed the way that they thought about things. But I think the fundamental idea of like, oh, this doesn't even need to be how it is like it's such a powerful and freeing thing. And I mean, I could never hope, I think, to achieve anything kind of quite on that level, but I think starting from like questioning the very premise of a lot of the sort of immediate crisis problems, and thinking about like how do you live in a way that like counters that, I think is really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. That's a really nice ending before my last question. Because books are time weapons. It's something I'm taking with me. But I have a more lighter question. Because in the book, the internet crashed unexpectedly. But what if you knew there wasn't any internet in like 2 weeks? How would you, like a kind of doomsday prepper, prepare for the end of the internet?
Oh my God. Like the first thing I do is I grab these hard drives that are plugged into the internet. I've got all my music on, and I would disconnect those from the internet on the chance that they wouldn't get infected or destroyed or whatever's happening. That's just a personal thing. And I have these, I'm that weird outlier person that still exists that buys music, and in digital form, purely in digital form. I don't buy music in physical forms anymore. I have too much vinyl to stop buying more vinyl, and it's in storage in the UK, and I haven't seen it for 10 years. So I buy and download music. I'm very opposed for ideological reasons to streaming and how it works at the moment. Not the concept of streaming, but the economic model behind it. Means production, exactly, is the phrase to describe that. And so I have all this music backed up on multiple hard drives because I've lost them before and lost me, blah, blah, blah. So in this weird space where I actually keep my music digitally on a hard drive, like nobody does that anymore, but it's very important to me. Apart from that, I don't know. Get lots of weed in. I'd be worried about a weed supply line being disrupted would be my first concern. And then I guess food after that. I'm not answering this very sensibly, sorry. Because it's like, I probably would just go, I told you so, and then die with lots of other people. It's probably what I'd realistically do. But
Yeah, I think there's like a Miranda July movie called The Future that has a part where the two main characters, in sort of an effort to kind of like embark on this big change in their life, they realize that like they're going to stop using the internet. And they're like, like I only have like, 2 more hours left of internet. And they're trying to figure out like, what do I do? Because like part of like being on the internet is like, you kind of just fuck around and pass the time, right? Like, so it's kind of, they're like sort of paralyzed. Like, oh, what is like, what's the saddest, what will I miss, right? I mean, I think to answer the question, I feel like Tim, I similarly would be like, I'm just gonna back up a lot of media, gonna get in some good torrents. I think I mean, are phones out? Are like, can people not talk on the phone?
Can't talk on the phone, man. No, that's rule number one. That's what everybody said to me in the book came out. Well, there'll still be phones. I'm like, you don't know how phones work. No, if there's no internet,
right.
phones.
Not even like the old copper shit. No, all right.
No, most of that goes through digital exchanges, though,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
that's
Still,
true.
as far as
Yeah.
I'm- yeah.
Okay, so phones are gone. If like, okay. So just, I'd be getting everybody's addresses so they could like send them mail.
That's nice.
I would go on Twitter and settle a few beefs. NGL. I'm going to do that. Because there's a few things I've been wanting to say to a few people now, which I probably will never say. And if I know for sure, 100%, got to know for sure that it's not coming back, and I've got a few hours. Yeah, man. Some people are going to get some truths. Sorry,
And with a bang.
again, not being very sensible.
Oh, maybe there are some questions of people watching this. I'm going to have a look. Oh, I've got a lot of questions. Wait.
Oh no.
Oh boy.
Wait. There are. Okay, someone is asking, and I'm don't know the lingo exactly, but maybe you do. I'm in enterprise tech, and it's a topic that is starting to percolate out well beyond the data center. Customers are asking for SaaS providers. Don't know.
Yes,
Software as a service.
Okay, who own no infrastructure themselves about this stuff. So it goes back up to supply chain, one link at the time. Oh, it wasn't a question. But
It
was more of a comment. It was more of a comment.
But it's a good comment, right? Like, I think this is the thing that like more and more people are recognizing is like, maybe it concerns them. And I think, again, like the thing of like the vast interdependence, like just realizing like how few software companies actually own the like racks that they do things on, again, means of production, then, and how like, yeah, how much is like how much even like at the cable level is like relying on like a small number of companies, and what that means when something goes wrong.
Yeah. What did you say ASS stood for again?
I think it's the software as a service. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh.
Yeah.
Someone is asking about the intersection, which is a little bit more optimistic. Tim, you wrote a screenplay for the intersection.
Oh, the intersection, the
Yeah.
Superflux thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a really cool project. That was really nice. So the funniest thing that happened about that was people going to me, "Wow, what's it like to work with Superflux?" And I was like, "This is like the 8th thing I've done with them over." Because I work with those guys a lot, Anab and John and their team. They're super talented, super smart, and we work together a lot. Usually like 2 or 3 projects a year, but most of them are. Like me, a lot of people in this like kind of field now, we make a lot of money, unfortunately, doing kind of corporate consultancy work, and it doesn't get released to the public, a lot of it, which is weirdly frustrating, because sometimes some of the most critical work I do is it's easier to get like, it's so easy, unfortunately, to get like companies to pay you to do critical work than it is to get publications to these days. It's my experience of this, which is not good. But anyway, So the intersection, yeah, but that whole story was John and Anab's story. It was the story that they had written, and then they came to me to write the script for. So it's told through a bunch of people talking to each other, a conversation of different people from different backgrounds having this conversation. I wrote that conversation, but the actual story, the actual beats, and actually what they wanted to say was all Anab and John's work. And for people who haven't seen it, go and check it out. It's a lovely, really good, like 15-minute short film. But it's about a bunch of people talking after the collapse, and various collapses have happened. One is a collapse of the internet and digital services. One is a collapse of context. One is a collapse of the environment, and one is a collapse of the economy. And there's people from different backgrounds coming together and talking about how they were optimistic after this and how they were able to rebuild after these collapses. And it's, yeah, in some ways, it's one of the most like optimistic things that I've been involved in, even though it doesn't necessarily look it at first. But this is, the point I was making earlier, really about dystopias. They're always about pointing them out. I feel is kind of should be, if it's done well, right, and not done exploitative or cheaply. I think it's a good way of being hopeful in some way.
I think what Superflux is really good at is making apocalyptopias. You know the definition of what it means. Like it's an apocalypse and a utopia, but it's hope from the rubble of the.
So this is the thing that's really, I don't know. I'm kind of trying to be more hopeful, but suddenly I'm not. The thing that's really hit me hard personally in the last like 2 years, right, is I've done these projects with Superflux over the years. I've done projects with other people similarly. And we always come to a point where we're like, well, how do you make these issues more an issue of concern for the wider public, or to the extent that democracies are activated to tackle them, to the extent that people start thinking, like Ingrid says about means production, and pushing back on that, whatever. And you always come up with this scenario. We've always fall back into this kind of scenario, people in my kind of field, is that things will get really bad before they get better. And there will be a big crisis that will unify people. So a big climate crisis, a series of extreme storms and simultaneously extreme, say, forest fires sustained for a period of time, will suddenly bring climate change home to a lot of people, and they will start thinking about it differently. The last 2 years have really, really shaken my belief in that strategy, right? And we had several global crises happen at once. Right? We had obviously COVID happen. The world did not. I think we all noticed the world did not come together and fix that in a unified way. It did not bring countries together. Did not bring
we already to be there were also like several fascists in power. And
precisely, yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of, fascists aren't known for that one group, they came together, the Axis.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't actually think things have tremendously improved. It's sort of a like Democrats, and so things get worse slower, maybe.
Exactly.
All right, I know this event is happening in Amsterdam, and I feel like such a provincial American bringing up these things. But I think,
like in Rotterdam last week, they had the police firing warning shots over rioters, right? Because of lockdowns and stuff.
Yeah, at rioters, not in the
area. Oh, really?
Was it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah, see, and that's the country that the rest of the world thinks is impeccably practical and pragmatic and sensible. That's the reputation, your nation has, like globally. That's why, and that reputation has with me after even living
that's
there.
That's where we have a lockdown looming over us right now, because we're so sensible and practical. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it kind of, that belief that some event will come along and kind of bring you all together is something I still lean on it as a narrative device when I'm talking about tackling problems and thinking about problems. There's a fantastic TV series called Occupied. I don't know if you know, it's set in Norway. It's a fantastic TV series about Norwegian TV series about there's a huge climate storms, and after climate storms, the Green Party just has a landslide election in Norway, and they decide to shut down their oil production, and the result is the EU goes into a flap and Russia invades and stuff. It's a great short story. It's a great TV series and worth watching. But I don't know that I believe in that setup anymore, is what I'm saying. I don't know that I've watched a bunch of crises roll through in the last few years, whether it's the rise of fascism, like say Ingrid, or whether it's COVID, or whether it's what happened in Texas. I mean, Texas isn't magically, changing their ways as a result of it, right?
I think a lot of this, like, I've been increasingly framing things as or framing the, like, how we get here, how these states is by thinking about how everything is a story, right? Like everyone has a story of how things work and what to be afraid of and what not to be afraid of. And you can't really, telling someone that their story is wrong is very hard. Changing a narrative. I mean, I spent like a long time in therapy on this very issue, right? And I think that I'm sometimes I get a little like cynical at the sort of like, well, we just need more stories, it's like I need fucking healthcare, like.
Yeah, exactly.
But like, I do think that like being able to look carefully at like what narrative do you believe right now, or what is sort of the dominant narrative that perpetuates things, like the narrative and like parts of that, and like how do you kind of work with that or respond to that? And I mean, yeah, there's a kind of intense individualism story that has kind of gained a lot of dominance, but that it's like kind of like individualism, but like also kind of like aggrieved together, right? Because like in a way, like we've had crises that have brought people together. They've just been brought together by like conspiracy theories and like like act like trying to like commit big like you know what I mean, like it's like, yeah, you have seen like some people kind of coming together like never before. It's just not in the way maybe like that helps people.
That was useful.
I mean, it helps them, it helps the people who believe in that story, but that story like harms everyone else. Yeah, that's I guess that's, and yeah, so, and I think again that concept of sort of just questioning the premise, it's like trying to figure out like why is this, who benefits from this story, who benefits from this being the story of like how the world works. And like usually it's like it's people who already have power, right? And so I find, I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about how to start from like the like baseline assumptions that are baked into this problem are wrong.
I saw somebody on Twitter this week saying, I didn't read the article, I just read the tweet, and saying that, that some research showed that like people didn't believe misinformation and conspiracy theories because they thought it right. They believed it because it sparked joy, to use that, Marie Kondo kind of phrase. And then also telling them that they're wrong or explaining why they're wrong or fact checking it does not spark joy. And I was just like, yeah. I mean, it's so obvious. It's so like obviously right. It's a dopamine hit, like everything else is a dopamine hit, right? And I didn't have an answer to that, apart from maybe we need to have a society that's a little based around joy, a little less. I don't know. Like, it just sounds like a really like joyless thing to say, but
just to bring it back to infinite detail, a thing that is like that's like, it's a story where like basically like everyone's got different kinds of stories, but like a big recurring theme is actually people show up for each other and take care of each other. And that's, again, it's not like like this is great. Like also there's like a land army.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the things, yeah, that's a thing that can be useful also in science fiction, is thinking about like what kind of like where do your values place you in this narrative? Like what would you do? And if, to be fair, it's like I think in some ways the last decade has been people having to, sorry, my hair's doing something and I just don't like it.
It looks great today. I was just thinking it looks great today.
But worlds, stories. Oh, I feel like the last decade, it sort of felt like a period of like people kind of getting the opportunity to answer questions of like what they would have done in like past eras of like fascist rule and past eras of like, you know, like great conflict and crisis. And like the unfortunate answer is like most of us are just trying to survive it. Like, and maybe are disappointing our past selves in what we actually are capable of like sacrificing or contributing. That was kind of a downer. Maybe there's another question.
I have a comment which I liked. Just a comment, but I really enjoyed the depth Tim went into in the music tech in infinite detail, which I agree to. Which I was rereading the book, and I was reading the conversation between College and Tyrone is like the non-digital native of the story. Like he was born just before the crash, so he only knows a world without the internet. And he was talking with someone about music because he's making music, and that before the crash. Oh, maybe you can explain better than me, Tim.
Yeah, no, that's it perfectly. It's that Tyrone's this kid. He's like sort of 15, 16 years old maybe, and he was only like 4, 5, 6 years old when the crash happened. Which actually, with hindsight, is old enough to be fully exposed to the internet. I realise now as a childless 50-year-old. But like you know, I'm not 50 quite, but I feel it. But yeah, he is trying to make music with a few kind of bits of like music tech that he's scrounged from here and there. The only music that's kind of survived in this scenario is kind of drum, bass, and jungle, which in Bristol is a big thing. It was the last music en masse that was being committed to vinyl in the early 2000s. Drum bass was the last scene to kind of resist going digital for DJs and stuff for various reasons. And so he's kind of he loves this music and he's grown up with this music, but it's also not his music. It's also my generation's music, and that's part of that same discussion. And it's kind of this interesting, like the one. So he's trying to work out, and the other character he's talked to College is saying, you know, that actually we are given so many choices when it comes to using technology to create culture now that can be really limiting and blinding and too much. And that personally comes from I make music just purely as a hobby. It's just purely a distraction. It's what I do to unwind. And, you know, I've got a few pieces of equipment here. I like in the last couple of years, I ditched using a computer to make, like I make house and techno, and I ditched using a computer to do it completely and just use hardware for this same reason that I found opening up, you know, Ableton Live and staring at it just killed any creativity in me, because it was too easy to either do something that everyone else was doing or to not know what to do at all. And that was kind of that point I was arguing, I think, with that. The thing that was interesting about music in the book in general is when it came out, I saw more than a few comments from people going, I picked this book up and I can't relate to the characters, which I'm always think it's the dumbest thing anyone can say about any book, but then to move on to saying like, and there's all this stuff about music in it. I thought it was meant to be a dystopia. Why is all this stuff about music? It seems really trivial and not important. The world's meant to be ending. Why are people worried about music? And I said to you, if you asked me what I was going to do, and the first thing I knew the internet was ending, was back my music collection up. I cannot imagine living through anything without music as an emotional crux for me personally. And I feel so sad for people who don't feel that way, I'll be honest. But, you know, that's my emotional crux. It's got me through every, you know, on a small scale, every breakup and every job I've lost, up to, you know, got me through the pandemic. Making music got me through the pandemic. Like I say, it's been a hobby of mine for like decades, but I started doing it during the pandemic because I needed to do something that occupied my brain in ways that weren't related to looking at news headlines or Twitter or thinking about things that I normally think about for work, which were the result of the pandemic, and a lot of stuff was the same things, and I needed an escape. And I can't. It's not trivial to need an escape in a crisis. It's been like Ingrid saying, you've got to find ways of living ethically, and if culture lets you do that, like in a time of crisis, it's a really powerful thing. So it was of course also for as long as I remember, I wanted to write a science fiction book with like good electronic music in it. When I started writing science fiction, a couple of people asked me to write for like collections of stuff about, this is about the future of music, or science fiction and music, and it was like everybody's writing about Bowie and stuff. Bowie's fine, not my thing, but he was great. I can understand how important it was, but it was kind of like there is science fiction music outside of like the 70s and prog rock and stuff, and science fiction is hugely important in hip hop. It's deeply important in techno. It's deeply important in drum and bass. It's deeply important in electronic music, and I actually got to the point I realized. For a while, it felt like a lot of people, especially from diverse communities, weren't really. When I started writing in around about 2010, that weren't really being involved in science fiction for various reasons. A lot of them to do with structural racism, obviously, and privilege, but also because I felt like a lot of people didn't need to. If you listen to the music I was listening to, you didn't really need to read science fiction novels almost, because that science fictionality, that ambient kind of science fiction, that kind of was there, like this music sounds like the internet, it sounds like the future, it sounds like technology, it sounds like, and it's a product of technology, right? And yeah, it's something I think about a lot, and I kind of put in a book, because I wanted to get some of it down on paper.
That person also said, I felt like I could hear it, which
that's very sweet. That's very sweet.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad that worked. So
yeah. I think that's a really nice ending also. Like somebody said, they are totally here for with your hierarchy of needs. Sorry, I can't really pronounce that, but that music and culture is just really important to get us through this.
We also need healthcare, and
of course,
and electricity, and food, and medicine, and student debt to be cancelled, and all these things. We need all these things to happen.
Definitely.
Well.
But I'm going to be like once again, have you heard of a man named David Graeber? But the book he co-authored with David Wengrow that just came out, I've like barely started it because it's ginormous. But there's one component of it is like kind of. There's a very utilitarian version of understanding like how societies form, and like culture sort of is mostly kind of like hierarchy and like establishing sort of order, and it's like there's also play. Like humans actually like have it in like a capacity for, and a sense of play that is very rare in most life forms, and to kind of deny that, well, it's such a boring world, like.
Yeah, exactly. What's the point of all this if you can't, at the end of the day, create and enjoy and be with other people in some form? And that's, oh my God, listen to me. That's what culture is. But there you go. That was very pretentious. I apologize.
Well, thank you to you both for this really interesting conversation, which ends on a kind of positive note. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Yeah, thanks for suggesting this.
Yeah, well, and for the people based in Nijmegen or in the Netherlands and want to follow the rest of Goodbye Internet, please check the website for updates on if it's going to be live or online. Tomorrow is going to be live, but Saturday we're not sure yet. So thank you all. Thank you for everyone listening and watching along. And thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. This has been great. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much.